The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to RDA's Tech Talk. Today's topic will be SQL 2014 and Azure integration features. RDA's Tech Talk series is designed to be a 30-minute technical presentation for the benefit of our customers centered around a current technical topic. We will have about 25 minutes of presentation demo and then address any questions you have at the end. You'll be able to ask questions at any point using the GoToWebinar Q&A interface. So I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Rich Cargile. And Rich is a business intelligence specialist with RDA and has over 13 years of experience as a database developer and consultant. So Rich, thanks for joining us today, and I will now turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Patty. Welcome everyone to today's presentation. Today we'll be talking about SQL Server 2014 and Azure, subtitled Breaking Barriers to the Cloud. You know, I think there's some exciting things going on with SQL Server 2014. You know, this version is, in my opinion, a little bit undersold by Microsoft. I kind of think it's on the edge of one of the larger revolutions in database technologies in recent past. The reason is that we have a new technology out there, and you may have heard of it. It's called the cloud. Microsoft's version of cloud technologies is called Azure. And you guys already know this, but one thing you may not know is how your organization can start to use cloud technology today. SQL Server 2014 can help you with that. You don't have to go all in with cloud technology. Your organization can kind of stick one toe in the water, if you will, and start using some of these new SQL Server 2014 features that I'm going to talk about today. This will help your organization integrate cloud technologies into your operations, get your people trained and familiar with cloud technology, and at some point in the future, you'll be ready to move quickly. So let's talk more about SQL Server 2014 and what's new. The biggest thing among several features of new features of SQL Server 2014 is its much better integration experience with Azure. And in particular, one of the things that really excites me is how you can use Azure VMs to create a low-cost, high availability, and disaster recovery solution. Now, before we get too deep into Azure, I wanted to kind of take a step back and show you some things. First off is how we can use Azure as your disaster recovery site. Another thing is how you can use Azure as your offloaded reporting site. Now, both of these first two features, disaster recovery site and offloaded reporting site, both of these use a technology called always-on availability groups. In addition to that, we have using Azure for managed backup strategy, and also how we can use Azure for historical and archive data. I wanted to talk about some Azure basics. The first thing that I wanted to show you or talk about was the Azure Data Service. This is basically a SQL Server database or a named instance of SQL Server. And you may have heard of this called Platform as a Service. And I've also heard it called Database as a Service. But it's basically that. It's a named instance of SQL Server that you can connect to, create tables, etc. In addition to the data service, we also have SQL Server VMs. And these are just like any other type of VM that you may have played with, say, VMware or something of that nature. But it's a full operating system with a C drive, a Windows installation, and SQL Server. It's got, SQL Server Management Studio. And you can connect to it and you use stuff like integration services, etc. Another thing is Azure Storage. And with Azure Storage, you can create storage accounts. And on those storage accounts, you can create storage containers blobs, and this is the one that we use with SQL Server. And we can use Azure blobs for things like storing SQL Server backups or creating some of our data files in Azure. Some other types of storage containers that we don't use so much in the database world, but you might use more as a .NET world or platform as a service, might be tables. And these aren't SQL Server tables. These are more programmatic tables that you could use to store things like containers and arrays and things of that nature. Another one is queues. In the same vein as Microsoft message queues, where you're storing messages and taking messages off the queue. I'm going to show you what Azure looks like and kind of demo some of its features and discuss more of what I just showed you. And we'll then look to see how we can integrate that with SQL Server 2014. So what you're seeing on my screen now is my Azure account and some of the objects that I've created. As you can see here on the left nav, I've got different objects that I can create inside Azure. Some of these objects that I just spoke about, I just talked about SQL databases, or platform as a service, or database as a service, and these are just plain old SQL databases. And I've got two that I've created, one called RDA Customer Big Data, and one called RDA Customer that I've been playing around with. And these are pretty much just standard databases that exist on a Microsoft server. And I can connect to these from my local laptop, and I've got SQL Server Management Studio running here on my local laptop. And so what we can do is we can go ahead and just connect to those databases, and just to show you what these look like, and we'll just connect to one of them. And let's see, that is that one. And I have to specify a port, and these use SQL authentication, those databases that we just saw, and I can just simply create tables and views and store procedures just like if it was any other database. And again, that's platform as a service or database as a service. The other thing I showed you was Azure VMs. These are one of my favorites here. I got one VM that's actually running, and we can connect to it as well. And this is what it looks like. And it's got a full install of Windows 8 and SQL Server. And we can connect to it just like anything else, any other VM, and look at the databases and do a number of things. Not only can I access it through a VM, but I can also connect to it from my laptop. The biggest difference is that you've got to, once you set up your VM, it comes with a built-in firewall. So you'll have to open up a port into the firewall so you can access it. But once you do that, then I can access it just like any other server. And that one is in my cloudnet.net domain. And again, there's the databases that I have already set up, and I can set up SQL Server Agent, integration services, and a whole host of different objects, just like I could any other server. Now again, that's called infrastructure as a service. The last thing I wanted to show you was the storage accounts that we looked at just a moment ago. And the main thing that interests us when we create these Azure storage accounts is allow us to create containers called blobs. And the reason why we want to do that is so that we can do a couple things with SQL Server 2014. We can use them to do things like store our backups in Azure and let Azure manage our backup process. We can also use these storage accounts for SQL Server data files. And I'm going to drill down on that here, on these concepts here as we move forward. But I just wanted to show you these. And even though we can access them here through the Azure UI, we can also access them through Management Studio. And this is SQL 2014 Management Studio. And I can connect to those Azure storage accounts here as well. And I just, here's one I've got. I've created this one for my backups. And I've got a couple of containers in here that I've already done some backups with. I've got another one that I've created for data files. And you can see that here. Okay. So that in a nutshell is just a brief overview of how Azure works and how you can connect to these databases. These are all very, very easy to create on Azure. Every one of these objects that we've just gone over, I can just hit New and create the stuff from a gallery. And to create a VM of any type I want takes literally minutes. And I could create a new SQL Server 2014 with Windows Server 8 in just 5 or 10 minutes. All right, let's come back to our presentation today. And let's talk about SQL Server 2014 and the types of high availability and disaster recovery that you have available to you. The first one is database mirroring. Now, one thing about database mirroring is it's been deprecated in 2014. This will be the last version that it's available. It's in very wide usage. However, the thing about mirroring is it has a couple of problems. The first problem is that you can only mirror one database at a time, and that's not so great for applications that might use a number of databases together, such as a SharePoint farm, which could have 7, 8, 9, 10 databases that really all need to fail over at the same time. The other I guess con of mirroring is that when you're in a mirroring session, the secondary isn't readable. It will sit there in a state of constantly recovering transaction log files, and you just can't read it until you actually do fail over. Now, in addition to mirroring, we also have excuse me, transaction log shipping, which also has some issues. The first is it's not automated. It doesn't automatically fail over. You have to manually fail over transaction log shipping. The second is it's difficult to manage. It's not the easiest thing to set up and keep track of. Always-on availability groups is one of my favorites, and it solves a lot of problems of mirroring and transaction log shipping. And we'll be talking more about availability groups and the benefits that they offer. And it's one of the enabling technologies for some of this close integration with Azure. I'm also going to talk about backup and restore with the Azure Blob Storage Service. Let's talk a little bit about always on. Now, this was introduced for the first time in SQL Server 2012. And to some degree, the term always on is kind of a marketing term that's used for a couple of different technologies. The first is always-on failover cluster instances. And failover cluster instances is the successor to active-passive clusters. You may have heard of this in the past where we have one active and one passive. And one feature of an active-passive cluster is you have shared storage. And the main benefit of failover cluster instances is it protects you from a hardware failure. If you were, for example, on your active-passive cluster, you had such as a backplane failure or a blue screen of death or something like that, your SQL Server instance would automatically fail over to the passive node. Okay, so a failover cluster instance is primarily an on-premise instance. It fails over at the instance level, and typically they will share storage. Now, another component of always-on, this distinct from failover cluster instances, is availability groups, and this is one that we touched on a moment ago. And it's more like the old mirroring, and it does solve a lot of the problems of, or the downsides of mirroring. Failover cluster instances and availability groups can be used in combination, and that's what's really exciting to me. Here we have a diagram of failover cluster instances and availability groups used in conjunction with Azure. And this will allow you to create a low-cost backup and, high availability and disaster recovery solution using Azure. As you can see, we have an on-premise failover cluster instance. On the right, you have your primary node or active node, and you also have your passive node. So this will protect you from a hardware failure on-premise. From a disaster recovery standpoint, let's say your entire data center gets hit by a tornado or some other serious problem with your data center, the whole cluster instance can fail over to an Azure disaster recovery site. With always-on availability groups, it's like mirroring, only much better. For one thing, the secondaries are readable, and this is the enabling technology for allowing you to use Azure as an offloaded reporting site. In addition, you can define an availability group to consist of more than one database. This is exciting for using failover or disaster recovery for, say, a SharePoint farm, because by defining up to 8, 9, 10, or an N number of databases, they all fail over at once, not just one at a time. You're allowed up to 8 secondaries per primary, and you can combine them. Let's say, for example, you had a set of databases, and let's say there were 4 of them, for example. You could, as part of the availability group, you could have one disaster recovery site and one offloaded reporting site, and that would be 2. You're allowed up to 8. So you could have several different options as any type of use you may find for your secondary. Now, for your always-on architecture, you can have the solution entirely on-premise, whereby both your primary databases and your secondary databases were all on-prem. You could also have everything in Azure if you decided to do that. both your primaries and your secondaries would all exist in the cloud in the form of Azure VMs. Lastly, and this is the one that's exciting, and this is the one that was depicted in the graphic I showed you a moment ago, is where your primaries are on-premise and your secondaries are in the cloud. And you can mix and match these. You can have some of your secondaries on-premise and some of them in the cloud. You've got a lot of flexibility here. Some additional SQL Server features I wanted to walk you through is using Azure for SQL Server data files. In addition to that, you can deploy your SQL Server databases directly to Azure. Lastly, you can use Azure for your managed backups. Let's talk about these. For Azure Managed Backups, you back up directly to an Azure storage account. And this is one of the things that you guys can get started using right away. And there's a lot of advantages here. You don't have to do things like, mess with the, the delivery service to, pick up tapes and drop off tapes and take them off to off-site storage and all that. Or another one is you have to worry about, do I have enough disk space? That's a constant worry in production, is running out of disk space for your backups. You don't have to worry about that anymore with an Azure storage account because you have an unlimited, literally an unlimited amount of disk space to back up your databases with. And the neat thing is you only pay for what you actually use. Manage scripts and check on the processes and so forth. You don't have to do that. Azure will keep track of how much data is actually the transaction counts that are coming in and make an informed decision on how often we should do full backups and how often you should do like differentials and transactions. Stuff like that. You'll set a few settings to help it get started, but it'll manage a lot of the stuff for you. Another neat feature of SQL Server 2014 and Azure integration is using Azure, an Azure storage account for your SQL Server data files. I'm going to show you a demo here in just a moment where we're using this feature where you create a database and you're using an Azure blob for one of the data files. Now, if you combine this with partitioning, this should allow you to archive data or maintain historical data in a different location. And you think of it this way, you could, if you were to partition some of, say, customer orders by age, you could move your orders older than 10 years over to a partition that's stored in Azure. Let me show you a demo real quick of some things in SQL Server 2014, and this is going to be running off my local instance of SQL Server 2014. The first thing I wanted to show you was I've actually got, this is my local instance here, and I've got AdventureWorks, and one of the neat features here is I can just go to tasks, and there's a couple of options in here that would allow me to deploy this database to an Azure SQL database. And this, again, we talked about this earlier, platform as a service, or it's also called database as a service. You'd also deploy it to an Azure VM. Okay. Another interesting thing is you heard me mention using an Azure storage account for your backups. And as you can see, I've got a couple of containers, storage containers. These are Azure storage accounts. One's called SQL Backup. And to back up to it is just backing up just like anything else. You right-click on your database, you go to Backup, and should be a familiar dialog box. This is how you've been backing up for years now. But instead of backing up to a disk or a tape, you now have the option to back up to a URL. And when you set this up, you specify your credentials and your storage container, and it'll just back up for you. The command to do something like this might look like this. Those of you who are script-based, you just use your regular backup database command to URL and specify your container name, the credentials you want to use, and some other information, and it'll back up for you. To allow Azure to manage the backup process, you use a set of new store procedures that are available in SQL Server 2014, and it's kind of like an API for Azure Managed Backups, and it's called Smart Admin. And this particular command called spsetdbbackup will allow you to automate your backup process, and it's this item right here, enable backup equals 1 or true, that allows this and sets this up, and it allows me to also encrypt these backups. There's a number of encryption algorithms available, so you don't want to store these backups and so that anyone can break in and grab your backup and restore it. You can actually encrypt these. One of the other things I talked about was using Azure for some of your SQL Server data files, and I set up a couple of, and these take a few minutes to run, so I'm not going to actually run these right this moment, but this is kind of an example of how this might work. Here I've got a couple of create database commands specifying different data files, and in this case right here, actually we'll start with the first one. This will create a local database, but all the data files actually exist on Azure storage containers, including the log file. This one, on the other hand, most of my data files are here on-prem, but I've got one of my data files that actually exists in Azure. Okay. So, wanted to sum up here and walk through some of the features we've talked about today. The first was using Azure as your disaster recovery site. And again, this is in summary. The enabling technologies here are SQL Server 2014, Azure VMs, and the always-on availability groups. The second thing we talked about today was using Azure as your offloaded reporting site. And again, this also uses SQL Server 2014, an Azure VM, and always-on availability groups with your secondary setup for read-only access. Another one is using Azure for your managed backup strategy. Lastly, we had using Azure for your historical and archive data, using Azure and the Azure-based SQL Server data files and partitioning. So in closing, some things you probably want to think about in SQL Server 2014 and Azure integration is, could you use Azure to manage your backups? I mean, would this benefit you? And you can think about all the benefits that this could do for you. I mean, first of all, you don't have to worry about running out of space for your backups. You also would not have to worry about off-site storage. A backup doesn't do you any good if the SAN that you back up to goes down. Okay. to really double protect yourself, you've got to store those backups off-site. And to save you the pain in the neck of having some type of delivery service, you can just store your backups in Azure and only pay for the space that you actually use. Now, could you use Azure to store some of your database files? Think through all the databases that exist in your enterprise, and they're constantly growing. Perhaps you could start storing some of your old data, anything that's older than 10 or 15 years. Maybe it might be a good idea to start putting those older data files in the cloud. Another thing is, could you use Azure as a global upload site for files? And think about just thinking out of the box here. We've got the Azure storage account, which basically would give you unlimited storage. Any interchange you might have with your customers. I mean, could you, instead of accessing your site directly, perhaps instead of sending the files to an FTP site, they just upload it to a cloud storage account. If you need any further guidance on this, call me. I'll be happy to help. You can reach me at cargyle@rdacorp.com. And Patty, I'd like to turn this back over to you and open up the floor for questions.
Excellent, Rich. Thanks so much. If you do have a question, feel free to submit that through the Q&A interface if you'd like, or if you want to select the question on your control panel, I can unmute your line and you can ask it directly. But Rich, we did have a question that I can start off with. So can you elaborate again on the difference between always-on availability groups and always-on failover cluster instances?
Sure. Always-on was introduced in SQL Server 2014, and it covers two primary technologies. The first, again, is failover cluster instances. And failover cluster instances protect you at the instance level. And this is, again, it's kind of like the old active-passive clusters that have been around for quite a long time. You have shared storage, typically, and you have an active-passive node. And the active is the one that you'll access most of the time. A failover cluster instance will have a virtual network name and a virtual IP address, and that's the one that you actually connect to with your applications. So that if you do have, say, a backplane failure or a blue screen of death or something like that, it will fail over to the passive node. And now the passive node is active, and the applications running against it don't know anything just happened. And again, failover cluster instances are at the instance level, and all the databases that are on that instance fail over at the same time. Now, availability groups is another component of always on, but it's like the old style mirroring. And one key difference is that you're talking about entirely different instances altogether. An availability group could be somewhere different entirely. And in this thing, in this presentation today, one of the exciting things we talked about is having your passive nodes, or actually they're called secondaries, in Azure. But the key difference here is that failover cluster instances typically are going to share storage where availability groups don't. Another thing is that all in a failover cluster instance, all the databases in that instance fail over at the same time, where an availability group is a set of databases that you define. Typically, a set of databases that would be part of the same application. such as, for example, a SharePoint farm. Does that make sense?
Perfect, thank you. And it looks like that we are just about out of time, so I am going to go ahead and close out. So thank you for a great presentation. We would like to thank everybody that joined today, and our next presentation is Wednesday, October the 8th at noon, and we'll be presenting Identity Federation. So thank you so much, and have a great rest of the day, and we look forward to you joining us next time.
Thank you.